Hello, everyone. This is module 6 for Justice Ends and Means. And this week, our part A for the workshop is tying together all the all the ideas that we've learned so far, looking at the idea of justice as rules, justice as precedents, and adding something else to the mix, adding the idea of justice as story. And there's an interesting interplay between these concepts, and quite often lay people just go straight to justice as story. Is it right? Is it wrong? How does it fit into my idea of how the world works? The law, in order to provide structure and certainty, has all these different ways of creating justice. There's created a clear and definitive rule set, the use of precedents to moderate and interpret those rules so that as time goes on and we get new situations, we are able to use those rules and apply them in those novel situations. And then those precedents form sort of a set of rules in themselves. And that's what we've looked at over those last few weeks. But at the end of the day, even going through all those technical procedures, for a decision to be seen as satisfying, there needs to be that narrative element. There has to be the story behind it. There has to be something that makes sense. Now, for years, law was in denial about this. In fact, when I learnt law in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a thing called the declarative theory of law that said that judges didn't ever make law. They just went out and found it. The law was all pre-existing, and the legal process just found what the law already was. And it's a legal fiction is the term that's used, but it was taught as a sort of an ideology, to sort of deny the role that judges have in making and creating law. And part of that was, I think, a real uncertainty about this aspect of narrative and story. So while we need those formal rules for a system of justice to make sense and to be consistent and all those other things a system needs to operate, in order for it to be acceptable to people, we also have to tell a particular story. And the same has things same thing occurs whether it's a low level drink driving case in the magistrates court or a high level constitutional law case. It's about telling the story that people find acceptable or not acceptable. And you'll see, in the United States, the overturn of the Roe versus Wade decision. Ultimately, there was not very much discussion of the formal law underneath it all and the constitutional law that drove that decision. Most of the discussion was, about that bigger story about whether Roe versus Wade was a decision that was revolutionary in protecting women's rights, or whether it was a unacceptable breach of the right to life for fetuses, or whatever the counter story that's being told. So this is how narrative and story fits into things. It's not enough by itself, at least most of the time, or at least it shouldn't be. But it's a crucial element. Now, the first part of the workshop today is Pet Court, which I made up as a sort of a silly, light-hearted way to apply these rules without having to get bogged down with all the legalese and the legal the bulk of the legal precedents. Now, some students have said they would prefer to a case study that was very serious and involved legal cases, and then I tell them they're going to have to read about 100 pages to do it, and they get a little less keen to do that. So one of the other advantages of this silly example is the rules and precedents are boiled down to really simple propositions. And even here is a simple set of propositions. I think it illustrates the complexity of that interplay, that ability to be able to observe those rules, to be able to recognize the precedents, but also tell a story in the way a judgment's made that makes sense to people, because sometimes a very strict interpretation of the rules ends up in a story that people don't find satisfying. So Pet Court, which actually ended up as a TV show at some point after I wrote this. I should have gotten in and made my pitch earlier. Here's this idea of like a fate court where this couple put their pets on trial for all their misdeeds, and basically what we have is the rules. We have sets of punishments that are available. We have precedents, and then we have the indictments. We have the actual specific things that have occurred. So for each of the indictments, it's a case of working through those stages, working through the rules, finding out where the rules are, where there's clarity in the rules, or where there is uncertainty in the rules, using the precedents to fill in that set of uncertainty, and then coming up with a verdict and a punishment that is acceptable. So that's the technical process, but you'll also find in many of these, there are decisions that if you follow the rules just absolutely to the letter, they may seem unjust. I mean, there's a situation where, for instance, the first one where a burglar, the dog is barking at the burglar, and there's a choice to follow the rules very strictly and punish the dog for the damage that the dog has done, or to say, and that would seem, in terms of narrative, to be a really unjust solution. The dog's trying its best, doing and accidentally causes damage along the way. The dog shouldn't be punished for that. So there's this gap here. And this ties directly into what we're talking about this week, in this appeal to, do you always strictly follow the rules, even if the consequence is something that's unjust? And there's no correct answer to this. And different people and different cultures have different ways of approaching this. And there are people who are very much by the rules. And they say that even though the consequences are absolutely unjust and unfair, we're always going to follow the rules strictly. There are other people who are just much more loosey-goosey, and they're like, well, I'll decide what I want to decide, and then I'll try and match it up to the rules later on and make the rules work for the decision I want to have. And sometimes that doesn't happen. I know in the history of our legal system, for many years, domestic violence was not admissible as evidence, where a victim of domestic violence later murdered the perpetrator. Now, normally, where someone's defending themselves, that's a defense to homicide. But if someone has not in immediate danger, even though they've been in terrible danger in the past and they've been abused in the past, the way the law used to stand, it's been changed. The way the law used to stand, there was not only was that not a defense to homicide, but it was not admissible as evidence. The jury never even heard about this history of abuse when it went in, when the case ran through court. And there are several cases where judges ended up convicting women who had this terrible history of abuse, and then waited till their husband was asleep and, not going to, and they're obviously not going to beat them in a fair fight, and killed them. And these are situations where the judges looked at the rules and the precedents and said, there's nothing we can do. We can't actually change these rules. They're strictly here. But in those cases, the judges said, we think this is a case where there should be a pardon. And I believe in the two of the major cases, there were pardons given. There was a conviction and then a pardon. And they were also then impetus for the government to change the laws around homicide to reflect those sort of scenarios. So, I mean, that's a bit of a tangent, but the point was there have been times in history where judges have had to make decisions that they think are really unjust and unfair, because the rules are really clear and there's no wiggle room for them to make a different decision. But in this case, you'll find that there's lots of wiggle room. The way the broad general nature of these rules, the ways the precedents have been inconsistently applied and applied differently in different circumstances, give plenty of room for argument for you to come up with a decision in each of these situations that is consistent with the law, but also tells inconsistent with that idea of justice as a story that you will find acceptable. All right, so that's the first part, and really, as I said, it's tying together everything we've learnt so far and using it to focus in on the on how we integrate all those elements. Now, next week we are going to do a more serious version where we're going to look at something that, it's going to be another fictional situation, because as I said, I don't think any of you guys want to read 100 pages of cases and another 100 pages of legislation for me to create this as a real situation. I struggle to get law students to do all that amount of reading. But next week follows on by looking in detail at how these legal principles apply to rules that are created by other organizations. And that's a concept we'll discuss more next week. But when we're looking at things like bylaws and rules of organizations, we've got another set of a set of complications that comes out of that. So this week acts as a bit of a primer for next week. The other thing is I will be putting up shortly the problem scenario for the major assignment. So you've got that to look forward to, and that will also involve all these skills. Also involve you looking at those different aspects of a situation and coming up with a solution on justice that's based on those different principles. All right. Now, the part B of the workshop this week, we're looking at evidence-based practice. And this is really a bit of a run through of how you use authorities, how you use from a legal point of view precedents, but from a social science point of view, research and research sources in your writing. And the first thing we teach you in terms of academic integrity, and you've all had to do the academic integrity unit, the first thing we teach you is it's the rules. You've got to do it, and if you don't follow the rules, you're guilty of misconduct and blah, 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 blah. But what I've tried to do with the material in this module and the exercise that we'll talk about in a moment is to have you think about the positive aspects of referencing. That it's not just a matter of you doing it because you're told you have to, but the way you use references, the way in which you use evidence in your writing is at the very core as to how you get marks. So we're not working in mathematics here, where if you come up with the right solution to a theorem, that's all you have to do. You get no marks for coming up with the right answer to a problem in social science. And in fact, most problems, if they're well written, don't have an answer. The whole point is that of us engaging with these issues is that they're ambiguous. If there was an easy answer for it, there'd be no point to have an expert look at it, would there, or a professional look at it. So I think we often get this idea, and I think we get it from our schooling, that the aim of the assessment we do is to come up with the right answer, and that's not true. And in fact, in many cases, if a problem is written well, it's impossible. However, I mean, in criminology, if you had the right answer to how to prevent someone from committing a crime, you'd be magic. We wouldn't need criminologists anymore because we'd have the answer to how to do it. What we've got is lots of different options of different various credibility. So when we're talking about evidence-based practice, that's saying, well, what evidence do we have for it? And how are we going to interpret and apply that evidence? So the prime activity that you're doing when you're writing an assignment, answering an exam question, or any sort of assessment is not coming up with the right answer. It's coming up with a really good set of evidence to back up the answer that you have. So if you think about it like that, hopefully you'll make it clearer that putting your references in, making sure it's all done properly, is not a matter of compliance. This is the nitty-gritty of how you get marks. Because if I have two identical assignments, one's referenced and one's another, an unreferenced assignment is a fail, not because of academic misconduct, because there's no evidence backing it up. It's just a bunch of opinions and ideas. But a good assignment can be identical to that one, but it has the backup. It has the reference to all the ideas and concepts and where they come from and how they're evaluated and how they're weighed against each other that makes all the difference. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about evidence-based practice. And it was a big deal in medicine a few years ago because they found medical education was very authoritarian and it was very much based on why do we do a particular procedure or use a particular drug or whatever in medicine. It was like, well, we're told to do it. We do it because we're told and we do what we're told. And the introduction, and that meant that a lot of medical graduates didn't have a lot of initiative, didn't have a lot of individual problem solving, and weren't good at exercising autonomy because they were just like, well, I just follow the rules. That's what I do in my job. And obviously that's a problem in medicine because it's a very complex field and you want people who can be problem solvers and can use that. So there was a big move to introduce the concept of evidence-based practice into medicine. I mean, I know medicine is so high status, it seems weird that people who get into medicine were not good problem solvers, were not good at thinking for themselves. But it was a real significant problem. So they introduced this idea of teaching medical students to use evidence, to weigh evidence, to say, well, this is what we usually do, but there's evidence that might not be the right thing to do, but other evidence that says this might be the right thing to do. You know, it's like the end of every House episode where the doctors are saying, we always do this thing. And House says, God damn it, man, that'll kill them. We've got to do this instead. And there's a big fight over whether House is right or wrong. And House does it anyway. And he gets threatened, he'll get sacked. And then you find out House actually is right. That wouldn't happen if your institutions actually were evidence-based. Not that House tends to have very good evidence for his strange ideas in medicine anyway, but let's leave that by the side. So yeah, the exercise this week is basically a political rant from someone who's not done any sort of fact checking of the things they're saying, and is to go through that and to look at where do you think there should be evidence for any particular statement. You don't have to find the evidence. You don't have to look this stuff up. That's not the issue. But where is a point in this speech where you go, is that true? What's your evidence for that? And that's a good start to start thinking about that in your own practice when you write something. And you say, you say something like, many criminals come from a background of disadvantage and poverty. Do you need to reference that? Is that a fact that is so well known and broadly known that you don't need to go to, Smith's book on poverty and crime? Or to be safe, do you want to go and put a reference to Smith's book on poverty and crime because you want to make it absolutely clear that you're not just pulling that idea out of the air, that you actually have a reason for it? So we have to make those decisions all the time. And if you're working in a discipline that uses one of the inline referencing systems, the in-text referencing systems, it becomes really important because my background, law, we use footnotes, and you can put 400 footnotes under a paragraph and it's not going to disrupt the flow of the text. And if you look at something like the Harvard Law Review, you sometimes have footnotes that go over multiple pages. Americans are very ridiculous in the amount of referencing they use, but you can't do that with APA or one of those inline referencing systems because you can't just sort of break your text and then have pages and pages of references. So it actually becomes much more important for someone who's working with that system in the social sciences or in psychology to be able to zero in on an efficient number of references to show that you're basing your statement on good evidence, but not so many that your text becomes unreadable because you've got heaps, 7 references after every line. So some things to think about, some things that you don't necessarily master straight away. It's a lifelong journey to figure these things out, but I think it's more productive to start thinking about evidence and practice than to focus obsessively on what the rules are, because the rules, like many situations, only really get you so far.